The Arizona sun doesn't just shine, it interrogates. It bleaches the very soul out of the land, leaving behind a silence so profound you can hear your own blood pounding in your ears. For a lone woman like Mariana Gable, a widow scratching a life from the dust at the foot of the Superstition Mountains, that silence was a constant companion. But on a day bleached white by the heat, a different sound ripped through the stillness. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the rattle of a snake. It was the terrified scream of a child, and in that moment Mariana faced a choice that would cost her everything she knew and offer her a future she could never have imagined. This is the story of that choice and the impossible price of compassion. The year is 1878. The place a stubborn patch of earth in the Arizona Territory that Mariana Gable called Providence. It was a name chosen by her late husband, Daniel, a man full of hope and scripture, who saw a garden where others saw only a graveyard for ambition. He had seen it right up until the fever took him 2 winters ago, leaving Mariana with just the half-built cabin, a dozen chickens, a mule named Absalom, and a silence that clung to her like the fine red dust. Providence wasn't a town. It was a testament to one man's failed dream and one woman's refusal to surrender. The nearest real settlement at Purgatory Creek was a half-day's ride away, a place she visited only when the flour ran out or the loneliness became a physical weight upon her chest. Most days her world was defined by the jagged purple peaks of the mountains and the vast shimmering expanse of the desert floor. On this particular Tuesday, the heat was a physical presence, pressing down with the weight of a blacksmith's anvil. The air wavered over the packed earth, distorting the horizon. Mariana was mending a harness on her porch, her calloused fingers working the leather with practiced efficiency. Her face, framed by wisps of sun-bleached brown hair that had escaped her bun, was a roadmap of her life. Fine lines around her eyes, from squinting into the sun, a firm set to her jaw that spoke of resilience. She was 28, but in this land years were measured in hardships, not birthdays. It was then she heard it. At first it was a faint, high-pitched wail, easily mistaken for a coyote pup. But it came again, sharper this time, laced with a pure, undiluted terror that cut through the oppressive heat. Mariana froze her needle, hovering over the leather. Absalom, tethered nearby, lifted his head and flicked his long ears towards the rocky wash to the south. Human. A child. Her heart hammered against her ribs. No settlers lived out this far. Her nearest neighbor was a prospector named Silas, who had vanished months ago. Travelers stuck to the main trail miles north. That left only one possibility, a thought that made the back of her neck prickle with cold sweat, despite the heat Apache. The stories from Purgatory Creek were grim, whispered tales of raids of fire and blood. The Apache were ghosts of the desert, they said, vengeful spirits defending a land that was no longer theirs. To find one of their children alone, it meant the parents, the warriors, could be anywhere, watching. Another scream, this one choked with desperation, was followed by a symphony of snarling and yapping. Wild dogs. A pack had been getting bolder, their ribs showing their eyes alight with a feral hunger that knew no fear. They'd already taken 2 of her chickens. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door, to load Daniel's old rifle, to wait for the awful sounds to fade. It was not her fight. It was the law of the wild, a law she understood all too well. Survival was a solitary business, but the scream came again, weaker now, a sound of utter hopelessness. In that sound, Mariana didn't hear an Apache. She heard a child. Daniel and she had prayed for a child, a prayer the Lord had never answered. The silence in her cabin was not just the absence of a husband. It was the absence of small feet, of laughter, of a future. Damn it all, she whispered the words, a harsh crack in the stillness. She dropped the harness and ran inside. Daniel's rifle, a heavy 1873 Winchester, was propped by the door. She grabbed it, checked the load and snatched a long skinning knife from the kitchen block, shoving it into the belt of her worn denim skirt. Her hands were steady, her face a mask of grim determination. Whatever was happening, she would not be a coward cowering on her porch. She moved quickly, her worn leather boots making little sound on the hard-packed earth. She kept low, using the sparse cover of creosote bushes and pale skeletal palo verde trees. The snarling grew louder, a chorus of guttural growls and frantic yips. She crested a small rise and looked down into the shallow, sun-baked arroyo. The scene below stole the air from her lungs. A small boy, no older than 5 or 6, was backed against a sheer rock face. His skin was the color of rich copper, his straight black hair matted with dirt and sweat. He wore only a breechcloth and tattered moccasins. His face was a mask of terror, tears carving clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. A gash on his small leg was bleeding freely, attracting the pack. There were 4 of them, gaunt, scarred mongrels with the look of true desperation. They were a mix of breeds abandoned by prospectors, now returned to a primal state. Their teeth were bared saliva dripping from their jaws. One, a big, brindle-colored brute with a torn ear, was the leader, inching forward, testing the boy's defenses. The child held a rock in his small fist, his knuckles white, his chest heaving with terrified sobs. Mariana raised the Winchester to her shoulder, the smooth wood familiar against her cheek. She took a breath, held it, and centered the sight on the brindle leader. The crack of the rifle was shockingly loud, a brutal violation of the desert's peace. The lead dog yelped once, a surprised, choked sound, and collapsed in a heap, its legs kicking for a moment, before falling still. The other 3 dogs scattered in a panic, their predatory hunger instantly replaced by cowering fear. One darted past her, a yellow blur of matted fur. The other 2 scrambled up the far side of the wash and vanished into the brush. Silence returned, heavier now, ringing in her ears. Smoke curled from the rifle's barrel, smelling of sulfur and finality. Down in the wash, the little boy had sunk to the ground, the rock falling from his hand. He stared at the dead dog, then up at her, his dark eyes wide, with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He didn't know if he had just been saved, or if a new, more dangerous predator had just arrived. Mariana slowly lowered the rifle, her heart still, pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the small, trembling child, at the blood on his leg, at the vast, empty wilderness around them. She had just fired a shot that could be heard for miles, a dinner bell for any number of dangers, human or otherwise. She had crossed a line, meddled in something she had no business meddling in, and in doing so, had bound her fate to that of a crying Apache child. The silence she had known for 2 years was irrevocably broken. Slowly, deliberately, Mariana started down the slope into the arroyo. She kept the Winchester held loosely in one hand, pointed towards the ground. She knew any sudden movement could send the boy scrambling away, injured as he was. Her mind was a whirlwind. What have I done? What in God's name do I do now? As she drew closer, the boy tried to push himself further against the rock wall, his small body trembling like a cornered rabbit. His eyes, dark and intelligent, darted from her face to the rifle, then to the dead dog. He was terrified, but there was a flicker of something else in his gaze, a defiant pride that was heartbreaking in one so small. "It's all right," she said, her voice softer than she intended, hoarse from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." The words were meaningless to him. He didn't understand English, and she didn't know a single word of Apache. Language was a wall between them, as solid as the rock behind him. She stopped about 10 feet away, respecting the invisible boundary of his fear. She laid the rifle carefully on the ground, then straightened up, showing him her empty hands. "See, it's okay." She took another slow step forward. The boy flinched, and a small guttural sound, half whimper, half warning, escaped his lips. He was trying to be brave. Mariana's gaze fell to his leg. The gash was deep, raggedly torn by the dog's teeth. It was caked with dirt and still weeping blood. If it wasn't cleaned, infection would set in with a deadly speed in this heat. Daniel had died of a fever. She knew how quickly life could be stolen by an unseen sickness. She looked back at the boy's face. He needed help. That was the only truth that mattered in this moment. Kneeling slowly, she gestured to her own leg, then pointed at his, her expression one of gentle concern. She mimed the act of cleaning a wound. It was a clumsy pantomime, but it was all she had. For a long moment, he just watched her, his breathing shallow. He seemed to be weighing the threat she posed against the throbbing pain in his leg. Finally, with an infinitesimal nod, he relaxed his small frame just slightly. It was permission. Mariana moved with a calm, measured pace she didn't feel. Her heart was a frantic bird in her chest. She approached him, knelt and gently examined the wound. It was worse than she thought. She tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her worn petticoat. She had nothing to clean it with here. She would have to get him back to the cabin. "We have to go," she said, knowing he wouldn't understand. She pointed towards her homestead, a faint silhouette against the sky. Water. Medicine. Getting him to stand was the next challenge. When she reached for him, he recoiled, his fear returning. She pulled her hands back immediately. Thinking quickly, she stood up and took a few steps towards the cabin, then turned and looked back, beckoning him with a small motion of her head. She would not force him. He had to choose to trust her. She waited. The sun beat down. The only sound was the buzzing of flies gathering around the dead dog. After what felt like an eternity, the boy pushed himself up, wincing as he put weight on his injured leg. He limped his small face tight with pain, but he began to follow her, keeping a careful distance of 10 feet between them. The walk back to the cabin was the longest of Mariana's life. Every shadow seemed to hold a watching warrior. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered threat. She was acutely aware of the small, limping boy behind her, a lost Apache child, a walking declaration of war to the people of Purgatory Creek, and a priceless treasure to his own kin. She was caught squarely in the middle. Once inside the cabin, the boy stood just inside the doorway, his eyes wide as he took in the strange, angular world of a white settler. The simple cot, the stone fireplace, the shelves with their tins and jars. It must have looked like a cave full of unnatural things. Mariana ignored his awe and went to work. She stoked the fire and put a kettle on to boil water. From a small wooden chest, she took out her precious medical supplies, a tin of carbolic salve, clean linen bandages, and a bottle of whiskey for disinfection. When the water was hot, she poured it into a basin and carried it over to him. She knelt again, gesturing for him to sit on the small wooden stool. He hesitated, then complied. As she began to clean the wound, he hissed in pain, his body going rigid, but he did not cry out. He clamped his jaw shut. His small fists clenched at his sides. He bore the stinging pain with a stoicism that shamed men twice his age. Mariana's heart ached for him. This was a child taught to endure, to show no weakness. She worked gently but thoroughly, cleaning every speck of dirt from the gash before applying the strong-smelling salve and wrapping his leg in a clean bandage. When she was done, she looked up and met his eyes. The terror was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful curiosity. He was hungry. His stomach betrayed him with a low growl. Mariana smiled a genuine smile that felt foreign on her face. She went to the larder and came back with a piece of cornbread and a strip of dried venison. She offered it to him. He took it cautiously, sniffing it first, like a wild animal before taking a small bite. His eyes widened slightly at the taste. He was ravenous. He devoured the food in minutes. For the rest of the day, a fragile, silent truce existed between them. The boy whom she silently decided to call Taza, a name she'd once read in a dime novel, sat on the stool, watching her every move. He did not speak. Mariana went about her chores, mending, cooking, feeding the chickens, always aware of the small, silent figure in her home. The cabin, usually so empty and quiet, now felt full. The silence was different. It was no longer the silence of absence, but the silence of presence of two worlds colliding under one roof. As dusk fell, painting the sky, in fiery strokes of orange and purple, a new fear began to creep in. His father, his people. They would be searching for him. And when they found him here in her cabin, what would they think? Would they see the clean bandage and the full belly? Or would they see a white woman, an enemy who had stolen their child? She barred the door and shuttered the single window, a precaution she usually only took during the worst winter storms. She laid a spare blanket on the floor near the hearth for Taza. He watched her, then curled up on the blanket, without protest, his back to the fire's warmth. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed him, and he was asleep. Mariana sat in her rocking chair, the Winchester across her lap, and watched him. In the flickering firelight, he looked so small, so vulnerable. He was just a boy. Her actions today had been driven by simple human instinct, a refusal to let a child be torn apart. But in this harsh land, simple acts had complex and often deadly consequences. She had saved him from the dogs, but she feared she had just thrown them both to the wolves. She sat there all night, listening to the sounds of the desert, waiting for the knock on the door that she was sure would come. 2 days passed, in a strange, suspended reality. The knock on the door never came. The boy, Taza, began to heal. The limp lessened, and the tight knot of fear in his face slowly unfurled. A tentative trust began to grow in the space between them, nurtured by shared meals and silent gestures. He pointed at a chicken, and she would say the word, chicken. He would repeat it, the sound foreign and clumsy on his tongue. He would tap his chest and say a word she thought sounded like Nakai. He was teaching her as much as she was teaching him. A fragile bridge of understanding was being built, one word, one gesture at a time. But their sanctuary could not last. The flour sack was nearly empty, and she was low on salt and coffee. A trip to Purgatory Creek was unavoidable. The thought filled her with a dread so thick she could taste it. Leaving the boy alone was unthinkable. Taking him with her was madness. She decided on the only course of action that seemed remotely possible. She would have to hide him. She explained with gestures, pointing to the small root cellar beneath the floorboards, then putting a finger to her lips. His dark eyes showed he understood. He nodded solemnly, his expression grave. The game of survival was one he knew well. The ride to Purgatory Creek was tense. Every rock formation looked like a warrior on horseback, every dust devil a sign of an approaching party. The town itself was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by a dozen sun-bleached wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office. It was a place that ran on suspicion and cheap whiskey. As Mariana tied Absalom to the hitching post outside Miller's Mercantile, she could feel the eyes on her. A woman living alone was an anomaly, a subject of gossip and speculation. A woman who kept to herself as much as she did was downright suspicious. The bell above the door chimed, announcing her arrival. George Miller, the proprietor, a balding man with a perpetually sour expression, grunted a greeting from behind the counter. His son, Frank Miller, was leaning against a barrel of pickles, whittling a piece of wood. Frank was a handsome man in a coarse, brutish way, with an air of entitlement that Mariana found repellent. He owned a small ranch nearby, and had made it clear on several occasions that he considered the Widow Gable a potential addition to his property. "Mornin', Mariana," Frank said, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Been a while. Starting to think a coyote dragged you off." "I've been busy, Frank," she replied coolly, handing her list to his father. "Too busy for company." He pressed a smirk playing on his lips. "I have all the company I need." Her curt reply did little to deter him. As his father gathered her supplies, Frank cornered her near the bolts of calico cloth. "A woman like you shouldn't be out there alone. It ain't right, it ain't safe. The Apache have been restless. We hear whispers. You need a man to protect you." "I've managed so far," she said, her voice tight. "That ain't managing, it's just surviving," he scoffed. "I could give you more than that." He reached out to touch her arm. Mariana jerked back, as if burned. "Keep your hands to yourself." Her sharp tone drew the attention of the other two customers in the store. Frank's face darkened with anger and embarrassment. "Too good for me are you living out there in the dirt like some squaw. Don't come crying to me when the savages burn you out." The word squaw hit her like a slap. She paid for her goods, her hands trembling with suppressed rage, and left the store without another word. Her relief at escaping was short-lived. As she was loading the sacks onto Absalom, a voice boomed from across the street. "Hold up there, Mrs. Gable." Sheriff Bartholomew Bart Cole was walking towards her. He was a big man, his bulk spilling over his gun belt. He carried the weight of authority like a shield, but there was a haunted, weary look in his eyes that never quite went away. His wife and daughter had been killed in a Chiricahua raid a decade earlier, a tragedy that had carved him into the man he was today, a bitter, unyielding enforcer of a brutal border justice. "Sheriff Mariana," said, her voice steady. "Heard a rifle shot from out your way a couple days back," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Just one." "Sounded like a Winchester." Mariana's blood ran cold. Of course, someone would have heard. The sound would have carried for miles in the still air. "Had a problem with a dog," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. "Part of that feral pack." It was getting too bold. The sheriff chewed on the inside of his cheek, his gaze sweeping over her, searching for any flicker of deceit. "Just a dog, you say funny." Ben Carter, over at the relay station, said he saw some Apache sign near the Twin Buttes the other morning. Fresh sign. Looked like a small party moving fast. You ain't seen anything unusual out your way, have you? This was the moment to lie, to build a wall of deception around her and the boy. "The only unusual thing I've seen is how brave those dogs are getting, Sheriff. Nothing more." He stared at her for a long moment, his disbelief a palpable force. "Well, you keep a sharp eye. This ain't a good time to be alone out there. Frank Miller might be a fool, but he's right about that. This land, it'll swallow you whole if you let it." He tipped his hat and walked away, but Mariana could feel his suspicious gaze on her back all the way out of town. The ride home was a blur of anxiety. The sheriff's questions, Frank's venom, the town's prying eyes, they were a cage closing in on her. She had lied to the law, a dangerous act, in a territory where a sheriff's word was absolute. When she reached the cabin, she threw the bar on the door and immediately pulled up the heavy wooden panel to the root cellar. "Taza," she called down softly. His small head appeared in the gloom. He scrambled out, his eyes blinking in the sudden light. He looked at her, then at the sacks of flour and coffee, a question in his eyes. He pointed outside, then made a gesture like a man with a big belly and a star. He had heard the sheriff. He knew. She nodded grimly. The danger was no longer an abstract threat. It had a face and a name. She had not only brought a child of the enemy into her home, she had now lied to the man who represented the only law in this unforgiving land. The fragile peace of Providence was about to be shattered. She had made her choice in the arroyo, and the consequences were now galloping towards her faster than any horse. The day after her trip to town, a new kind of tension settled over the cabin. It was the heavy humming stillness that comes before a storm. Mariana found herself constantly scanning the horizon, her ears straining for the sound of hoofbeats. Was it Sheriff Cole coming to ask more questions, or was it something else, something older and far more dangerous? Taza felt it too. He stayed close to the cabin, his childish playfulness replaced by a somber watchfulness. He would often climb the small rock outcropping behind the house and sit there for hours, a small, still silhouette against the vast blue sky staring east towards the rising sun. He was waiting. The waiting ended on the fourth day. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor. Mariana was outside scattering feed for the chickens when she felt it first, a low, rhythmic vibration in the soles of her boots. It was the feeling of many horses moving together. Her head snapped up. On the ridge to the east, silhouetted against the blood-orange sky, were 5 riders. They were not cowboys. They were not the sheriff's posse. They sat on their wiry ponies with a natural, fluid grace that seemed to make them part of the animal. Even from this distance, she could see the glint of rifle barrels and the stark, proud lines of their figures. Apache. Fear, cold and absolute, seized her. Her first instinct was to grab Taza and run, but where there was nowhere to go. The desert was their home, not hers. Her second instinct was for the Winchester inside the door. But then Taza, who had been beside her, let out a cry. It was not a cry of fear. It was a single piercing word of pure, unadulterated joy. He began to run towards them, his recently healed leg moving without a hint of a limp. The lead rider urged his horse forward, breaking from the group and cantering down the slope. As he grew closer, Mariana could see the details that marked him as a leader. He was a tall, powerfully built man, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the surrounding rock, all sharp angles and deep-set, intelligent eyes. His black hair was held back by a simple leather band. He wore buckskin leggings and a warrior's vest adorned with intricate beadwork. A beautiful repeating rifle was sheathed at his side, and a knife with a bone handle was tucked into his belt. There was an aura of command about him, an unshakable authority that was as much a part of him as his own skin. Taza reached him, and the warrior leaned down from his horse, sweeping the boy up into his arms in one fluid motion. He held his son close, his stoic face softening for just a moment as he buried his face in the boy's hair. The relief and love that passed between them was a language Mariana understood perfectly. This was his father. The other 4 warriors had fanned out, forming a silent, menacing semicircle around her homestead. They sat motionless on their ponies, their dark eyes missing nothing, their faces impassive masks. They were waiting for a signal from their leader. The chief settled his son in front of him on the horse and rode forward, stopping a respectful 20 feet from where Mariana stood, frozen by the chicken coop. She had not reached for her rifle. What good would one gun be against 5 warriors who seemed to have sprung from the very earth? Her life was now entirely in this man's hands. His eyes met hers. They were dark and piercing, and they held no readable emotion. He was studying her, taking in her simple, worn dress, her calloused hands, the lone cabin behind her. He looked from her to his son, who was now chattering away in his own language, his small hands gesturing towards the cabin, then pointing to the arroyo. He was telling the story. The chief listened patiently, his gaze never leaving Mariana's face. She could only imagine what he was hearing, how this white woman had found him, how she had killed the dog, cleaned his wound, fed him, hidden him. When the boy finished, a profound silence fell. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the world was bathed in the soft purple light of twilight. The chief spoke his voice, low and resonant. The words were in his native tongue, completely incomprehensible to her, but the tone was not one of anger or aggression. It was questioning measured. He shifted his gaze to the door of her cabin. He wanted to see inside. Her heart hammered. This was the true test. Swallowing her fear, she gave a slow, deliberate nod and walked to the cabin door, pushing it open. She stood aside, her posture betraying none of the terror she felt. It was an invitation. Dismounting with a lithe grace, he handed Taza's reins to one of his men and walked towards the cabin. He moved with a quiet confidence, his moccasins making no sound on the dusty ground. He paused at the threshold, his tall frame filling the doorway. He looked inside his eyes, taking in the simple, clean interior, the hearth with the banked fire, the neatly made cot, the pot of stew simmering on the stove, the empty blanket on the floor where his son had slept. He saw the evidence of care. He saw the truth of his son's story. He turned back to face her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something she could not have predicted, a deep, profound, and solemn gratitude. It was an acknowledgement of a debt. Without another word, he turned, walked back to his horse, and mounted. He settled Taza behind him, and the boy waved a small, hesitant goodbye to Mariana. The chief raised his hand, a brief, formal gesture. Then he turned his horse, and with his warriors falling into formation behind him, rode back the way he had come, melting into the deepening twilight as silently as they had appeared. Mariana stood there until they were gone, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. She was alive. She was unharmed. But she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this was not over. It was not an ending, but a beginning. The Apache chief, whose name she didn't know, had seen her act of compassion, and in his world such an act demanded a response. She had no idea what form that response would take, but it was coming. A week passed. The memory of the 5 silent riders was so vivid it felt more real than her daily chores. Mariana lived on a knife's edge of anticipation. She found herself looking to the eastern ridge every morning and every evening, but it remained empty. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps the chief's silent departure had been the end of it. A simple retrieval of his son, a debt acknowledged and closed. The thought brought her a strange mix of relief and an odd, inexplicable disappointment. The silence of her life had returned, but it now felt emptier than before. Then on the 8th morning they returned. This time there were only 2 riders, the chief and one of his warriors. They were not dressed for war. They led a 3rd horse, a magnificent paint mare with a coat of white and deep brown patches. The mare was saddled, not with a rough pony rig, but with a finely tooled leather saddle that was clearly of settler make, though it was decorated with intricate patterns of blue and white beads. Mariana was drawing water from the well when she saw them. She set the bucket down her heart, beginning its familiar, frantic beat. She wiped her damp hands on her skirt and stood her ground, waiting. The chief, whose name she would later learn was Cale, rode directly to her, his expression as stoic and unreadable as before. He dismounted and handed the reins of the paint mare to her. She stared at the horse, then at him, confused. I don't understand. The other warrior, a younger man with a lean, watchful face, spoke in heavily accented broken English. He gives this to you. A gift. Mariana was stunned. A horse like this was a fortune. It was more than she could have earned in 5 years. I can't accept this. It's too much. It is not a payment, the warrior translated his eyes, conveying the gravity of his leader's intent. It is a mark of honor. You saved his son. Taza, his only son. You showed courage. You did not act as an enemy. Kyle spoke again in his own language, his tone deep and firm. The warrior listened, then turned back to Mariana. He says you live alone. This is not good. This land has many enemies. His enemies. Your enemies. Mariana looked from the magnificent horse to the chief's unyielding face. She was beginning to understand that this was not a simple transaction. This was something far more complex, governed by a code she was entirely ignorant of. Kyle then reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out 2 more items. The first was a heavy bracelet of polished silver and vibrant blue turquoise, crafted with a skill that was breathtaking. The second was a single perfect eagle feather, its tip wrapped in red-dyed leather. The warrior's voice was low, almost reverent. This is for your protection. He held out the bracelet, so that our people will know you are a friend. He then held up the feather. And this is a sign of his word. Kyle stepped forward himself. He took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man so formidable, and slid the turquoise bracelet onto her wrist. The metal was cool against her skin. Then he looked directly into her eyes and spoke. His words were solemn, carrying the weight of a sacred vow. The warrior translated his voice, dropping even lower. He says a woman of such honor should not be without a protector. A family. A tribe. A cold dread mixed with a bewildering sense of awe washed over Mariana. She had a terrible feeling. She knew where this was leading. The warrior took a deep breath before delivering the final, stunning message. He is Kyle, chief of the people of the Morning Star. He has no wife. He asks you to be his wife, to join his people. He makes a promise of marriage. You and your home will be under his protection. No harm will ever come to you. This is his promise. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mariana stared speechless at the impassive face of the Apache chief. Marriage, it was insane. It was impossible. It was a proposal from a different universe. This wasn't a request fueled by affection or courtship. It was a formal declaration, a political and social contract of the highest order. He wasn't asking to move into her cabin and share her life. He was offering to absorb her life into his, to make her one of his people, to bind her to him with the most sacred promise his culture possessed. He was offering her the ultimate gift his people could bestow, a place among them. Tell him I am honored, she stammered, her mind reeling. But I am a white woman. My husband is dead. I cannot. The warrior translated. Kyle listened, his expression unchanging. He said something short and final. He understands this is not your way, the warrior said. But it is his. The promise has been made. It cannot be unmade. He will not force you. But the offer stands. He will return in 1 moon at the time of the fullest light. You will give him your answer then. Until that time, you are under his protection, whether you accept it or not. And with that, They were gone. They left the paint mare tethered to her porch rail, its presence a beautiful, impossible, and terrifying reminder of what had just happened. Mariana sank onto the steps of her porch, her head in her hands. On her wrist, the heavy turquoise bracelet felt like a manacle. She had saved a child from a pack of wild dogs. In return, she had been given a horse worth a man's life, a bracelet that marked her as a friend to a people her own race called enemies, and a marriage proposal from an Apache chief. The people of Purgatory Creek would call it collaboration. Frank Miller would call it an abomination. Sheriff Cole would call it treason. She looked at the magnificent horse, then at the bracelet on her wrist. These were not just gifts. They were a claim. Kyle had drawn a circle of protection around her, but in doing so, he had also placed her in the center of a battle she could not possibly hope to win. News like water finds a way to travel even in the driest of lands. It only took one visit from a wandering trapper who spotted the magnificent paint horse at Mariana's homestead for the whispers to begin in Purgatory Creek. A horse like that didn't just appear. It had to come from somewhere. And when the trapper also mentioned the glint of turquoise on the widow's wrist, the whispers turned into a low, angry hum. Frank Miller fanned the flames. His bruised ego and simmering resentment found a perfect outlet. He strode into the saloon, his voice full of righteous fury. An Apache horse, and she's wearing their silver. I told you, she was strange, living out there, alone. She's consorting with them, a squaw lover, trading favors for trinkets, while they raid and kill honest folk. The fear and prejudice that always simmered just beneath the surface of Purgatory Creek boiled over. Men whose fear of the Apache was a constant gnawing presence were suddenly galvanized by Miller's accusations. It was simpler to have a target, a tangible enemy they could confront. Mariana Gable became the focus of all their hatred and fear. She was a traitor in their midst. Sheriff Cole listened to the talk, his face grim. His own personal hatred for the Apache warred with his duty to the law. There was no law against owning a good horse, but a woman alone receiving gifts from a renegade band. It was a spark that could ignite the whole territory. He was also a politician of sorts. His authority rested on the will of the people, and the people were demanding action. He found his justification when Ben Carter, the relay station manager, rode in his face pale. "Sheriff, I seen 'em. A half-dozen warriors sitting on the ridge overlooking the Gable place. Just sitting there, watching, like buzzards over a fresh kill. That was all Cole needed. It wasn't just gifts anymore. It was an armed presence, an occupation. He saw it as a direct challenge to his authority, to the sovereignty of the town. "Get a posse together," he ordered his deputy. "We're riding out to Providence. We're going to get some answers." Mariana saw them coming from miles away, a rising cloud of dust on the horizon. It was a sight she had been dreading. There were at least a dozen riders with Sheriff Cole and Frank Miller at their head. They rode not as visitors, but as an invading army. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. She tethered the paint mare behind the cabin out of sight. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and stood on her porch. The Winchester held loosely in her arms pointed at the ground. She would not be seen as a cowering victim. This was her home. The posse reined in, forming a half-circle around her cabin, their horses kicking up dust, the jingle of harnesses, and the creak of leather filling the air. Their faces were a mixture of anger, fear, and grim determination. "Mariana Gable." Sheriff Cole boomed, his voice carrying the weight of the law. "We've come on account of some disturbing reports. Reports of you harboring and consorting with hostile Apaches. I have harbored no one." Sheriff Mariana said, her voice clear and strong, defying the tremor in her heart. "And I have consorted with no one." "Don't lie to us," Frank Miller shouted, his face red with fury. "We know about the horse. The gifts, you're their whore." A low murmur of agreement went through the posse. "That horse was a gift," Mariana said, directing her words to Cole, ignoring Miller. "Given in thanks for an act of mercy. I saved a child's life." His father was grateful. Grateful Cole scoffed, his face a mask of disbelief. "An Apache's gratitude is a knife in the back when you're not looking. We know they're out here. Carter saw them watching this place. What are they planning, Mariana? Are you helping them scout a raid on the town?" The accusation hung in the air, venomous and deadly. To the men of the posse, it was the only explanation that made sense. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," she shot back. "They are watching because the boy's father offered me his protection." The men burst into derisive laughter. "Protection?" Miller sneered. "That's what he's calling it now. I say she's a traitor. She should be strung up. Enough." Frank Cole commanded, though his eyes were still hard as flint. "Mariana, you're going to turn that horse over to me. And you are going to come back to town where we can keep an eye on you. For your own safety, of course." It was not a request. It was an order. She was being arrested, her property confiscated, her home stripped from her. Everything she and Daniel had worked for, about to be taken away because of one act of compassion. She raised the Winchester slightly. "This is my home, Sheriff. You are not welcome here. And that horse is my property. You have no right." The click of a dozen rifle hammers being cocked was the answer. The situation had escalated. It was a siege, a dozen guns against one. "Don't be a fool, woman," Cole warned, his hand hovering over his own pistol. "There's only one way this can end. Give up now." Mariana stood her ground, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. She was trapped. If she surrendered, she would lose everything and face the mob justice of Purgatory Creek. If she resisted, they would kill her where she stood. But as she stared into the hostile faces of the men she had once considered her countrymen, she realized they were not the only players on this field. Her eyes drifted to the eastern ridge. It was no longer empty. Silhouetted against the afternoon sky, just as Ben Carter had described, were the warriors. There were 6 of them, including Cale. They were not hiding. They sat on their horses, still and silent, a clear and unambiguous statement. They were watching. They were waiting. They were bearing witness, and Sheriff Cole and his posse were now caught between a stubborn widow and an Apache war chief. The siege of Providence had begun. The standoff was absolute, a fragile moment stretched taut between 2 worlds. The men of the posse who had ridden out full of righteous fury now shifted nervously, their eyes darting from the defiant woman on the porch to the silent, ominous figures on the ridge. "This is your last chance." Mariana Sheriff Cole said, his voice strained. "Tell your savage friends to leave. They are not my friends to command." She replied, her voice clear and strong. "They are here because their chief made a promise, a concept they hold sacred." In a move that stunned every man present, Mariana leaned her Winchester against the cabin wall and walked down the steps into the open, her hands empty. She was vulnerable, protected only by her own staggering courage. "Look at you," she said, her gaze sweeping across their faces. A dozen armed men, terrified of a woman, and a handful of ghosts on a hill. You came here led by the greed and bruised pride of one man. She fixed her eyes on Frank Miller. "You don't care about safety, Frank. You care that I refused you. You can't stand that an Apache chief showed me more respect than you ever could. So you call him a savage, and me a whore to make yourself feel like a man." Miller's face contorted in rage. "Shut your mouth, you traitorous witch!" He raised his rifle. He never fired. A sound like a hornet zipped past his ear, and wood splintered from the porch railing beside his head. Everyone froze. On the ridge, Kyle held his rifle, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its barrel. It was an impossible shot, a warning that he could kill at will. Panic finally broke the posse's nerve. A younger rider fired a wild shot towards the ridge. The world erupted. The Apache warriors vanished, and 2 precise shots rang out from the rocks. One of the posse members cried out, clutching a bleeding shoulder. Another's horse screamed and fell. Kyle's warriors were not waging a battle. They were systematically dismantling the posse's ability to fight with terrifying efficiency. The men of Purgatory Creek scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the hills. "Stop, Mariana!" screamed her voice, cutting through the gunfire. "Sheriff Cole, stop this now." "You fired first, from the rocks," Kyle's voice called out in clear, deliberate English. "Sheriff, we have no fight with you. Leave the woman. Leave this place." It was an offer of peace, an exit from a battle he was clearly winning. Cole was a bitter man, but not a fool. He saw his panicked men and the cold precision of his unseen enemy. "Fall back," he roared. Back to the trail now. The men withdrew, helping their wounded companion. Frank Miller was the last to leave his face, a mask of pure hatred. "This isn't over." He spat at Mariana before spurring his horse into a full retreat. As the dust settled, Kyle and his warriors rode down from the hills. He dismounted and walked towards her, his face grim as he surveyed the bullet scars on her cabin. "They will return," he said, his voice low, "with more men. They see you as an enemy now, because of me. They see me as an enemy because they are ruled by fear." She corrected him softly. "I made my choice when I heard your son crying in the wash." He studied her face, his expression filled with a profound respect. "My promise stands," he said. "But you cannot stay here. It is a death place now. Come with us. Be one of us." He paused, and his next words were different, stripped of formality. "My offer, it is not just of a chief to a stranger. It is of a man, to a woman of a strong heart. I will teach you our ways. You will teach me yours. Together we will build a lodge for Taza, a home, in the mountains, a place of peace." This was no longer a political contract. It was a true proposal, born from the conflict they had just shared. He was offering her not just safety, but a future, a family, a life. It was a leap into a world she didn't know, a choice to abandon everything she had ever been. But what was she leaving behind? A lonely cabin, a town that hated her, a past filled with grief. She looked at Kyle, at his proud, solemn face. She saw not a savage, but a leader, a father, a protector. She looked at her bullet-scarred home, a symbol of a life that was now forever gone. "I have nothing to pack," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. Kyle's stoic expression finally broke into a small, answering smile. He gestured to the paint mare which had remained unharmed. "Your horse is ready." Mariana Gable did not look back at the small cabin named Providence as she rode away. She rode east towards the mountains beside an Apache chief, a turquoise bracelet on her wrist. She was leaving the ruins of one life to build another, not as a captive, but as a partner. She was no longer a widow, living in the silence of the past, but a woman riding towards the untamed future, a living bridge between two worlds. Real courage. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more incredible true life tales from the untamed heart of history. Thank you for listening.